Today, we're going to dig into something we do every single day, but rarely stop to think about: communication. I mean, how an idea actually gets from my mind to yours. It sounds so simple, right? But when you really look at it, how does it actually truly work?
No, really, just take a second. How does a complex, kind of abstract thought that's floating around in my brain manage to travel through space and perfectly reconstruct itself inside your head? It feels a little bit like magic, but it's a process, and a super fascinating one that we can actually map out and understand.
All right, so here's the game plan. First, we'll nail down a clear definition. Then, we're going to decode some of the classic models people have come up with. After that, we'll see why context is literally everything, uncover some of the hidden jobs that language does, and finally, see how all this theory completely changed the way we teach.
Okay, let's kick things off with the big question. What is communication? At its very core, it's all about exchanging meaning. And to really get a grip on this, it helps to look back at one of the first modern stabs at a definition. So, this definition from way back in 1928 really zeroes in on a shared experience. You see, for Richards, communication wasn't just about sending a packet of information. Nope. It was about influencing another person's mind so that they have an experience similar to yours. That's a much higher bar to clear, and it really sets the stage for what we're actually trying to achieve when we communicate. So, if that's the goal, this shared experience, how do we get there? Well, for decades, thinkers have been sketching out models to try and visualize this process. And you know what? Almost all of them start with one simple guiding question.
And here it is. Political scientist Harold Lasswell nailed the absolute bedrock question: who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect? Just about every communication model you'll ever see is, in one way or another, trying to answer that.
The first big attempt to model this was the Shannon-Weaver model. It's elegant, it's simple, and it's basically a straight line. Think about a phone call. The information source, that's your brain. The transmitter, your mouth. The channel is the air, the phone, all that tech. The receiver is the earpiece on the other end, and the destination is, well, your friend's brain. Simple, right? A to B. But as we all know, life is never that simple. And here's the first complication. They called it entropy, but we'd probably just call it noise. And listen, this isn't just about static on the line. It could be anything. Maybe you're distracted, or there's a cultural misunderstanding, or the language itself is just a bit fuzzy. It's literally anything that gets in the way and distorts the message.
So, how do we fight all that noise? Well, our greatest weapon is something called redundancy. Now, this doesn't just mean repeating yourself over and over. It's about cleverly adding extra bits of information to make sure the main point lands. Like, if I say, let's meet tomorrow at 3 p.m., and then I add, so that's 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, I'm using redundancy to stamp out any possible confusion. But the real game changer came when a guy named Norbert Wiener added one crucial element: feedback. All of a sudden, that one-way street becomes a dynamic loop. The receiver's response, a nod, a confused look, a question, it travels back to the sender, and the sender can then adjust their message on the fly. This one idea completely transformed communication from a simple broadcast into a living, breathing conversation.
But you know, that feedback loop doesn't just happen in a vacuum. The where, the when, and the why of any exchange are just as important as the what. And this brings us to our next huge idea. Context is everything.
We can think about context in two main ways. First, there's the linguistic context, basically the words surrounding other words. The word bank means something totally different in riverbank versus moneybank, right? But then there's the big one, the context of situation, the real world. Who are you talking to? Where are you? What just happened? Shouting fire in a crowded theater is a very different act than saying it calmly around a campfire.
So linguists actually came up with frameworks to pick this apart. Himes had this super detailed checklist with 8 different parts. But Holliday, he simplified it into this really powerful trio: field, mode, and tenor. Basically, it just asks 3 simple questions: what's going on, how is it being communicated, and who's involved?
Let's make that real for a second. Imagine a language class. The field is what's happening. They're studying language, specifically colors. The tenor is all about the people and their relationships. You've got a teacher and students, each with their own specific role. And the mode is how it's all happening, through talking, listening, and maybe some written exercises. See? Those 3 things perfectly capture the entire situation. So we've got our model, we get context, but what are we actually doing with language? I mean, the obvious answer is sharing ideas, But honestly, that's just scratching the surface. Language is more like a Swiss Army knife with all these surprising, hidden functions.
Sure, you've got the referential function, just stating facts. But we also use language to be expressive, like shouting, yes, when your team scores. We use it for social glue. That's called phatic communication, stuff like small talk about the weather. We even use it to do things. When you say, I promise, you're not just describing a promise, you are making it. And of course, we use it to signal our identity, to show we're part of a certain group.
And this leads us to a really, really important distinction. The famous linguist Noam Chomsky talked about linguistic competence, which is basically knowing the grammar to build a perfect sentence. But Del Hymes came along and said, whoa, that's not enough. He introduced communicative competence, which is knowing the social rules of how to use the language. So the big takeaway here is, it's not just about making a correct sentence. It's about knowing when to say it, who to say it to, and how to say it appropriately.
Okay, so we've got all this theory, models, context, competence. How does any of this actually shake out in the real world? Well, its biggest impact was in completely flipping how we teach and learn languages. Yeah, this new way of thinking sparked a full-blown revolution in education. Back in the 70s, teachers started to push back against just drilling grammar rules. They realized the goal wasn't just to know about a language, but to actually be able to use it. And that led to what we now call communicative language teaching, which is pretty much the gold standard across the globe today. And a huge idea behind this whole shift comes from Stephen Krashen. He makes this great distinction between learning, consciously studying grammar rules, and acquisition, that subconscious way you just sort of pick up a language by using it, just like a kid does. And Krashen's big argument is that real fluency, that natural ability to speak, comes from acquisition, not just from learning rules from a book.
So what does it take to make a classroom activity truly communicative? Well, you need a real reason to communicate, a purpose. The focus has to be on the message, not on getting the grammar perfect. But the secret ingredient, the most important part, is something called an information gap. That's where I have information that you need to get. It forces us to have a real exchange, turning language practice into a puzzle we have to solve together.
So, let's wrap this all up. What are the big takeaways? First, communication isn't some static one-way street. It's a dynamic, feedback-driven process. Second, being truly competent in a language isn't just about knowing the grammar, it's about knowing how to use it in the right way at the right time. And finally, language is this incredible multi-tool that we use for so much more than just sharing facts.
It really all comes down to this. Every single conversation is a negotiation of meaning. It's shaped by these models, by context, and by our hidden purposes. So the question I want to leave you with is, if that's true, what are you bringing to the table to make that negotiation a success?